Hey guys, and here we go with section 3 for chapter 29. The Allies turn the tide. So while the U.S. entering the war would have some serious long-term impact on the war's outcome, in the weeks right after it entered, the Axis powers continued their winning ways, right? A lot of the stuff that we talked about from the previous section. The German Blitzkrieg was wreaking havoc in Europe, and the Japanese continued to expand its empire in the Pacific. Now, the U.S. and the Allies realized that in order to win, they needed to engage in what is known as all-out war. We learned about the concept of total war back in chapter 26, when we learned about World War I. It's this idea that everybody, not just the soldiers, but everybody even on the home front needs to give everything in order for the war effort. The Allies gave a similar effort in World War II that we talked about in World War I. Now, this means that governments have to take control of the economy as well. Governments did things like ordering the rationing of food. Rationing means that you control how much people will consume or how much is given out to people. This is an ad for sugar rationing, but they also ration fuel, they ration metal. You used to have trucks that would drive through towns and you would throw scrap metal in there. Rubber was a big one as well. They sold war bonds. That was, kind of a propaganda for getting people to buy war bonds. War bonds are kind of banknotes that you pay for up front, but then the bank, or in this case the government, doesn't have to pay you back until later. So it's a way for the government to make money immediately. They also kind of would reduce their personal freedoms. Now, I know this is something that we don't usually think of with Western democracies like the U.S. and Great Britain, but it did take place in war. Wartime, you always have to kind of struggle with this balance of security versus freedom. And in wartime, okay, here you see you can tell that by the sleeve, okay, what this is representing, the American government: quiet, know your place, shut your face. There was another expression: loose lips sink ships. Everything was about national security, especially after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, where there was this fear that Japanese spies or even German spies had kind of worked their way into America. So there was a tremendous amount, well, I shouldn't say tremendous, but there was a lot more censorship of the press. There was more kind of restriction of freedom of speech than America was used to. There was also a regular use of propaganda. Right? Now, we know what propaganda is. It's used to try and persuade, your side to get you either pumped up or to hate the other side even more. This is a British propaganda poster. We beat them before, shown against fighting the Germans in World War I. We'll beat them again, right? Pump up the side. But it was used by the Axis as well. This is a German propaganda piece talking about the evils of what was called Bolshevikism, of the Soviets, of the communists. You've got the evil Soviet kind of, whipping down upon the good people, right? So it was meant to kind of get the German people fired up as well. All right. Now, women were being picked up were pitching into the war effort as well. Millions of women had to replace men in the workforce as they went off to war, and the American character of Rosie the Riveter came to symbolize women contributing to the war on the home front. Now, having fully committed itself to the war effort, the U.S. was now poised to make significant impact, and by 1942, we start seeing Allied victories. In the Pacific, the Japanese experienced some serious pushback. Now, much of these early victories were in the air. The U.S. was making regular use of a new type of ship called an aircraft carrier. It was new at the time, at least. Nowadays, we consider it very standard for our Navy. And why this creates such an advantage is that it can launch fighter planes from the middle of the Pacific, right? They don't have to launch from an airfield on an island or on a mainland or anything like that. And a very significant American victory during this time was the Battle of Midway. Now, you see the orange line, the Japanese expansion to April 1942. Don't worry about this Yamamoto's plan. That's what this guy Yamamoto in Japan had hoped to win. Here's Hawaii. All right, so that's where Pearl Harbor is. Here's Midway. You can see why is it called Midway? It's about midway to where you start getting into Japanese territory. It was very, very important for them to win this battle. And as I said, it was fought in the air. It was a major turning point in the Pacific. Right, so this became kind of more of the scene of these air battles. You had battleships and destroyers on the water, and they'd be firing up, and the rest of it was just planes kind of dogfighting amongst each other. The Japanese lost 4 aircraft carriers, so that was huge, and they lost over 250 planes. They were never able to mount a major offensive again. Right, so that's why Battle of Midway was a big turning point. Now, also, after the U.S. entered the war, the Allied leaders began meeting to plan their strategy. The Allied leadership was represented by what became known as the Big Three. The big three you see here are Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President of the United States, and Joseph Stalin, the Premier of the Soviet Union. They all agreed to concentrate on finishing the war in Europe before giving all their focus to Japan. Now, even though they were allies, there was always distrust between Stalin and the other two. And this mistrust would lead to problems after the war, but for now, they agreed that Hitler and Japan were the bigger enemies. Now, in order to gain inroads into Europe, the Allied strategy was to first work its way into North Africa. From North Africa, they could make their way across Mediterranean and into Sicily. Let me move me out of the way here. All right, so they had to win a number of battles on the deserts of North Africa, but after that, they were able to stage invasions into Palermo here in Sicily, and then Salerno here in Italy, Naples, and then work their way up the boot after that. Now, after defeating the Italian forces, the Italians overthrew Mussolini in 1943. He was driven from power, but fighting would continue in Italy for another 18 months because Hitler sent German forces to troops to reinforce those still loyal to Mussolini. Now, nevertheless, besides the fighting in Italy, the Allies had gained the upper hand. In the Soviet Union, the major turning point was the Battle of Stalingrad. Now, move me again. We discussed in the previous section how the German blitzkrieg was slowed by the Russian winter, and they were unable to take northern targets like Leningrad and Moscow. You see the extent of the yellow for as far as they went. So what Hitler decided to do was focus on a southern target, and for personal reasons, he really liked the idea of taking a city named after Stalin, so they focused on Stalingrad. Excuse me. This battle turned into one of the costliest of the war for both sides. Huge casualties on both sides. Here you see piles of dead German soldiers. It also took on a very new dynamic. You saw urban warfare emerge more in World War II than you saw in previous wars. World War I was still primarily fought on bigger open fields, okay, where they would dig the trenches and so forth. World War II, they learned from those mistakes. They said, we're not fighting in trenches anymore. That doesn't work. So it was just taking kind of the area by area. And when you're dealing with a larger city like Stalingrad, sometimes it's taking it block by block, but you can see the devastation that was caused by it. And by November of 1943, excuse me, the Soviet army had encircled the Germans that were attacking the city, and without any reinforcements, by January, the Germans were defeated in Stalingrad. Now, as I said, this was a major turning point. Oh, sorry, let me just show you the picture of them waving the red flag within Stalingrad, signifying that the Germans were defeated. Now, why this was such a big turning point was that by 1944, the German army was in retreat, right? So all of these arrows that you're seeing here, they are now going back this way. So the German army is now retreating through Eastern Europe, and they're being pursued by the Soviet army. That's going to be important to remember when we talk about that at the end of this chapter and in the next chapter with the Cold War. Now, because of Mussolini's fall and Hitler's defeat in the Soviet Union, by 1944, the Allies were really ready to make a push into Germany. Now, this strategy, conceived by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, he was supreme Allied commander of both the American and British forces. It called for an invasion of France and to push the Germans back into Germany itself. This invasion would take place on June 6, 1944, on what has become known as D-Day. Now, D-Day was the largest military invasion in world history. Allied forces launched across the English Channel from southern England into a region of France known as Normandy. Okay, you see here, Normandy invasion. All right, that's what this area of France was known as. Taking the beaches of Normandy was the first priority, and the Allies experienced heavy resistance from the German forces. But through sheer numbers, they were able to. You see, after gaining a beachhead, about how many thousands and thousands of troops came through. The early troops had to fight their way through by making landing on what were called duck boats. Right? These boats would pull up the front, almost kind of like a garage door would open up, and then they would just pour out. It was bloody fighting. It was rough fighting, but the Allies were able to gain a beachhead and then start to work their way through. Now, after successfully gaining control of Normandy, from there they were able to continue their Allied advance. All right, so let me just erase this. Right, so from here, they were able to work their way through Belgium, through the Netherlands, and from France directly into Germany itself. All right, so you see how the British forces focus mostly in the northern areas through Belgium and Netherlands, whereas the Americans really push forward directly across the border with Germany. So after gaining back control of these territories, the Allies engaged in nonstop bombing of Germany. Military bases, factories, railroads, even cities, they were devastated by Allied bombing runs. Here you see an Allied bomber kind of as it's going over German targets. But they weren't just for the military targets. Here you see the destruction that was wrought in different cities. This is the city of Hamburg, which was practically leveled after a bombing run. And this one, which is somewhat infamous, some people felt like this was a shameful act by the Allies because it was targeting a residential city that really didn't have any military strategic point to it. But this was the German city of Dresden, where over 100,000 people were killed. Now, despite the questionable morality of this strategy, it was very successful in weakening the German war effort. So defeat was closing in on Hitler. And that's what we're going to be talking about in the next section with the defeat of both Germany and Japan.